I'm visiting a second grade classroom. A classroom where I had heard they did class meetings of the kind that I described in the last episode of Cone Zone, where students got to participate in making decisions even though they're only 7 years old. What I didn't count on when I visited this particular classroom in Missouri is just how much say they would have over how the class meeting itself was run. In fact, they ran it themselves. When I walked in, it took me a minute to find the teacher, which I think is always a good sign in a classroom, whether it's elementary, middle, or high school. Teacher was over amongst the kids listening as the child who had rotated today into the position of being the meeting facilitator was running the meeting, while one of her classmates had a magic marker and was marking down in invented spelling what was going on in the meeting to keep notes. There was a big chair, looked almost like a throne. Everybody could put their name on the blackboard if they wanted to participate and say something or ask something. And when it was their turn, each kid would come and sit in the giant chair and let us know what they wanted to share. While I was there, one child came up when she was recognized by the facilitator, sat in the chair and said, "At recess, when we play Foursquare, the other kids are keeping the ball away from me on purpose." The facilitator thanked her, restated her understanding of what the child had said, and asked, "What should we all do? Who has some ideas?" And as people raised their hands to share possibilities, a sort of sophisticated ethical meta discussion began to take form right in front of me, where the kids were trying to figure out not only what she might do, but whether their role was just to throw out suggestions for her to consider, or to come up with one suggestion that they all agreed on. They played with all of this. It was an astonishing class meeting, and it went on for more than 45 minutes without any of the kids losing attention and getting bored or antsy. These are 7-year-olds. Not all class meetings are going to be like that, but even with teacher-led meetings, which are far more common, the question is going to be, who's doing most of the talking? It shouldn't be the teacher. Not when the goal is for the teacher to empower the students. Who gets to decide? Part 2. I'm Alfie Kohn, and this is Cone Zone. When we bring the kids in on it, which should be the watchword, the motto for teachers of kids of all ages, how do we decide how to solve this problem? Bring the kids in on it. That begins in the very first days of school, where teachers should not just be putting up a list of rules for kids, but to have the kids construct the rules. And not just construct rules, but better yet, construct the sense of how we want our classroom to be. Much better than a black and white series of specific do's and do nots. Because when you have do's and do nots, the understood question is, what's going to happen to the kids who break the rules? There are actually teachers who pride themselves on giving kids some choices by asking them what we should do to the kids who break the rules. I don't know if you've ever been in a classroom where teachers invite kids to come up with those ideas, but kids come up with hair-raisingly harsh, punitive consequences, inventive, bordering on sadistic. And if you look at that, you might have the temptation to say, well, obviously, if kids are not of a certain age or seriousness, they can't be allowed to participate. But no, the problem here is that the kids didn't have enough say in the broader question of how we want our classroom to be. The teacher's role is to expand the conversation beyond what most kids in our society are used to, which is you should do this, and if you don't, here's how we'll make you suffer. To help them move beyond the punitive framework in which so many of us, including adults, are trapped. How do we want our classroom to be? How can we help kids to think about that? I'll give you 2 examples for early in the class year. What if on the very first day, a teacher asked the kids, how come school sucks sometimes? Many teachers, especially elementary school teachers, in my experience, are often reluctant to invite bad news into the classroom. But that doesn't mean the bad news and the unpleasant experiences don't exist. It's just a question of whether students feel safe to share what has happened to them. So imagine that the teacher says, I know sometimes in your other years of being in school, sometimes you couldn't wait for the day to be over or even the year to be over. What kinds of things, I don't want to hear, don't mention names of teachers you didn't like, but what kinds of things were going on in the classroom that made school terrible for you? As in many class meetings, it often makes sense to have students pair up and exchange ideas. That way, shyer students can just talk to one person and nobody gets left out of a pair. And then we can report out of the pairs and write down what a lot of kids had to say. And when you have a list of experiences that made school unpleasant, you then proceed to the second step, which is, what do you think we can do in this classroom this year to make it less likely that stuff like that will happen? That's a way of going beneath the behavior of specific rules to get at how we want our classroom to be based on experiences we want to avoid. Or, you could do the flip side. What made school terrific sometime and what will make it likely in here that we can recapture those kinds of experiences. Here's a second idea that you can ask at the beginning of the year. Sometimes all of us do things we're not proud of. We say hurtful things to others, for example. We act out in bad and troubling ways. All of us do that sometimes. If that happened to you and you act in a way you weren't proud of, how could the rest of us in this classroom help you get through it? Come up with some specific ways that we could be helpful to you if you did something bad. And then you share the experiences. And then step 2 for this activity is, how could we help someone else who acts in a way that's troubling? Very few people, at least on reflection, will say, if I do something troubling, you should punish me for it. That will help me. If anybody does say that, it's just because they think that's what the teacher wants to hear, or because they've never been invited to think past a punitive culture that they're used to. But if you know that punishment is just going to make things worse for you, the next step is to help kids to see that it's just going to make things worse for everybody when they do it. So how can we construct a working with environment in here instead of a doing to environment? These are ways of going beyond rules, beyond voting, to thinking deeply, constructing sense about social environments and moral obligations. And for us here today, the key is construct, that the kids have a role in doing this. Whatever it is. In an old-fashioned, traditional elementary school classroom, the kids are often forced to line up and walk silently when they go to recess or to lunch or to an assembly. But work backward instead from the goal, which is presumably, and you can ask the kids, do a lot more asking, a lot less telling. What's the goal here? The goal is going to be to move safely and quietly across the school so we don't disrupt other classrooms. And if that's the goal, why would we have to resort to the most extreme, almost militaristic approach of silence and lining up? Instead, I'm going to ask you, how can we achieve these goals? This is not only beneficial because kids get to participate in making decisions, but also because they're going to be more attracted to, engaged with whatever it is they came up with because they came up with it. And it's going to promote critical thought. This is another way of promoting intellectual as well as social and moral development. Why would I have you raise hands so I and only I get to decide who talks? Let's move backwards from the goal. The goal is so we don't all talk at the same time and we can hear each other. How else could we do that without vesting all the power in the adult and no power in the kids to decide who talks when? How could we figure out how to take turns in here and have a discussion without my having this authority? It's amazing stuff. I'll tell you about an even younger classroom that I watched. It was a kindergarten, as I recall, and there was an understanding that when the lights flipped on and off, that meant stop what you're doing for a second and listen up. But what made this classroom, this kindergarten, different was that everybody in the room had the authority to flip the light switch up and down if there was something that person needed everyone else to hear. I got to tell you, I was not proud of my first reaction when I heard that. I thought this place must look like a lightning storm all the time. But it didn't. Presumably what the teacher had done at the very beginning of the year is introduce them to the technique of flipping the light switch to get everybody's attention, which they might have already been familiar with from preschool or whatever. But she then said, everybody can do this. And she kind of waited for kids to catch on to the possible problem. And a kid presumably said, yeah, but if we all can do it, we'll all be doing it all the time, and then nobody will even notice when the lights go on and off. What was the teacher's reaction to that? It wasn't, you're right, only I shall have control of the switch. No, it was to ask, what do you think we can do in here so that doesn't happen? What an amazing opportunity for kids to think about that and to figure out how to use it selectively, how to avoid that pitfall, while still having democratic control of the light switch. All these social and intellectual benefits of kids having more say are lost every time the teacher arrogates to herself or himself the sole opportunity to control something, to decide something. Now, you'll understand that the teacher, if I've been clear here, has a very active role to play in all of this. In that second grade class meeting I started with, the kids didn't walk in at the beginning of the year knowing how to facilitate a class meeting. It took a lot of work to get them there. The teacher has to do even more work. It requires far more skill, not to mention courage, on the part of teachers to do real autonomy support. So please don't confuse this with a laissez-faire, a hands-off model where the kids basically decide everything for themselves and the teacher is just over in the corner drinking her coffee. It's not laissez-faire. And it doesn't exclude structure. It's not a free-for-all. A structure is not the same thing as control, even though a lot of adults use the language of structure and how people need that to try to rationalize controlling them. For example, if there's a schedule in the class where there's an understanding we start our day normally doing this, and then we move on to do that after a certain amount of time, that's a structure. What distinguishes structure from control is that good structure is flexible, not rigid, and the people involved help to devise the structure rather than having it laid on them. The teachers can be involved in this process in many different ways, directly and indirectly. For example, directly would be we decide stuff together, we negotiate. Indirectly would be I have to give you some parameters for what we need to do, mainly because I, as the teacher, don't get to decide everything, and there's stuff that I, too, am compelled to have you do. But if I'm given those parameters, I'm going to invite you to participate in thinking about what we do within them. So that's an indirect involvement. But whatever the teacher's role is in this, the decision-making has to be about stuff that matters, not the trivial stuff where you don't really care what the kids do one way or another. If the kids don't have the chance to make a decision that makes you a little uncomfortable, then you haven't really supported their autonomy at all. You've just gone through the motions of that. So if the benefits are so remarkable, and if it's feasible to do this in so many different ways, why don't more teachers have classrooms that look like this? If we were talking in person, if this was a workshop I was facilitating, I would stop here, ask you to turn to somebody near you and brainstorm some possible answers to that question. But I will suggest a few. First, as I said before, teachers often don't get to decide a lot of stuff. They're pressured from above. As my old friend, the developmental psychologist John Nichols, whose writing should be much better known than it is, Nicholls, Education as Adventure is one of his books. John Nichols said, a lot of principals don't want to hear a buzz of excitement in classrooms. They want to hear nothing. In other words, teachers are often evaluated not because whether students are engaged and happy or curious and caring. Their teachers are evaluated based on whether the kids are silent and orderly. There's a risk for many teachers who create an intellectually vibrant classroom of outspoken critical thinkers. The teachers have to show a fair amount of guts to do this if they have old-style, traditionalist, top-down administrators telling them what to do. Second, I think this isn't more common because for many teachers, they don't even need any outside pressure. They may have a conservative ideology already. A lot of teachers I know, let's be honest, value obedience. And it never occurs to them that kids could decide on how to allocate class time or construct the curriculum or decide on the assessment or decorate the walls. And a lot of parents, too, think that a good classroom is one that the teacher is firmly in control of. Never mind that that's psychologically and intellectually counterproductive. And a third related reason is because of not just the ideology of many teachers, but their psychological needs. Fascinating study some years ago appeared in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, the lead researcher named Daphne Bugental. And here's what she and her colleagues wrote. Individuals who are unsure of their own power, when placed in a position of nominal authority, are the ones who are most likely to rely on coercive control tactics. Isn't that fascinating? They may actively seek out such positions. If you feel powerless in your own life and convinced that other people don't listen to you, you may be drawn to a job where you can damn well make people listen to you. And look at you. As in, I need all eyes on me right now, boys and girls, and so on. So whatever is playing in here, I think we have to be very honest that it is tough to give up control. If you're used to being the queen or king of your classroom, history teaches us that monarchs don't always abdicate gracefully. Mea culpa. I was a teacher, and almost every decision in my classroom, especially when I started out, was made by me. What are we going to read next? I'm thinking of when I was teaching high school. What would be the format by which you respond to the reading? How would I assess your responses? How much time would we allocate to each topic and unit? Are we going to talk in our small groups today or as a whole class? If we have conflicts, how will they be resolved? Will you have to do more of this at home? Have homework. How will the chairs be arranged? What will the room look like? To be honest, it never occurred to me to ask the students about any of this. Hey, it's my classroom, isn't it? Well, unfortunately, yes, it was mine, but only because I kept all the power to myself. And frankly, the kids were the poorer for that. What I wish that somebody had invited me to understand is that the learning starts when the teacher gives up some control. And doesn't just give up control, but as I said in the preceding episode, offers kids the chance all the time to be making choices, and not just making choices from a menu, but constructing possibilities. Another time when I was teaching a high school elective course for many years that I loved, I was so invested in this course. I couldn't, in between the terms when I was teaching it, I was tweaking it, polishing it, perfecting it, getting it ready. I really loved this course of mine. That's the way I thought about it. It was my course because I designed it and I taught it. It wasn't for years, till years later, that I realized that made about as much sense as a person who's single saying, I have this great marriage here all ready to go. I just need to find somebody to have it with. A real course. I mean, here's the point. You don't just create a curriculum for kids, you create it with kids. That's what I said on the last episode. And that means you don't get too invested in the course. You take your pleasure and your pride from how you're helping the kids learn and get excited about learning, not just from your curriculum. And, even the most thoughtful lesson, even the cleverest assignment, even the richest reading list is much less likely to goose students, to engage them, to help them think more subtly if you came up with it on your own and imposed it on them. What matters isn't what we teach, it's what they learn. I hope you know that. But the probability of real learning is a lot higher when kids have a lot to say about the content and the process. And that means that good teachers are always monitoring themselves, both prospectively and retrospectively. Prospectively meaning thinking in advance, like tomorrow, when we're going to do this, should I be deciding this on my own, or should I bring the kids in on it? And if I do, what's the best way to do that? Always thinking about that as one aspect of what's coming up in school tomorrow, alongside all the rest of the stuff. Sorry to give you one more that we think about of what's going to happen tomorrow in class. Always alongside that should be, and how do I support kids' autonomy in the way we do this? How do I do it with them? And then retrospectively means, where did we not do that? Like when you're driving home and you take your hand off the steering wheel, smack yourself on the forehead and say, why the hell did I decide that when I could have brought the kids in on it? That takes insight, it takes guts to catch yourself, especially at an exercise in pseudo-choice, where you kept hold of your power. Traditionalists keep hold of their power overtly. Groovy teachers keep hold of their power more subtly so they can keep thinking of themselves as enlightened, even though in most respects sometimes they're really continuing to be in charge of everything. Because that's easier than giving away that power. I think, in sum, that we need to change the default. When I've written and spoken about homework, I've argued that the default should be no homework. Kids don't have to work a second shift of academics when they get home from a full day in school. The research shows there's almost never any benefit. There's no research finds any benefit below high school, in fact. And kids want to be able to develop and grow in other ways besides academically when they get home. Maybe on some occasions, it's really necessary or likely to be beneficial to make kids do more academics when they get home. But the teacher should have to opt in to those exceptional circumstances. The default is none. And similarly, the default in a classroom should be let students decide this, except when there's a really good reason why we have to decide it for them. There will be those exceptions for reasons having to do with safety, for reasons having to do with inexperience, for reasons having to do with requirements placed on us as the adults too. But those should be exceptions. And the way we have a classroom is that unless there's a good reason not to do it, kids get to decide.